This month, Dread Delusion is finally completed and removed from early access. This is the latest release from James Ragg, aka Lovely Hellplace, and it's a project I have been following since its very early alphas. Most of this video will be dedicated to a bit of a deep dive into what I thought about the gameplay, aesthetics, and story, but if you're wondering my basic thoughts, it's this. This is a solid game with a few flaws that I'm sure will be patched within like a month or so, but as is well worth your time if you like RPGs, particularly if you like Bethesda RPGs. It is nothing short of commendable that a team this small was able to make something this solid, and as a longtime fan, I am very pleased with the end product, so keep that in mind as I get into my critiques, both positive and negative. For future reference, I am reviewing the 1.0 version of the game, and if things I mentioned were fixed in the future, please disregard that particular point. For the most part, none of these minor issues really built up into anything substantive. So the comparison you're going to see most often to Dread Delusion, heck, it's in the title of this video, is that it is like Morrowind, the third Elder Scrolls game. Now to me, something being like Morrowind has various signifiers that I do think Dread Delusion fits, but it's important to break them down for people who may not be aware. The thing about Morrowind and its various contemporaries of the time, such as Gothic, Arx Fatalis, Thief the Dark Project, and so on, is that they were made at a specific intersection between advancements in technology and development teams. The type of environment where small teams are able to make some pretty unique games and have them be successful in the mainstream. Morrowind was the first truly 3D Elder Scrolls game in terms of character models and all that, and it was the reason quite a few new people got involved in the series and video games on the whole. Two factors to Morrowind still stick out to me all these years later. First, its art direction is still incredibly beautiful, with incredibly surreal landscapes that feel both otherworldly and completely believable. The technical limitations give everything this magical vibe that isn't really conveyed in more modern entries. This folds into the game's, well, gameplay. It's a bit of a running meme that Morrowind's combat is absolutely abysmal due to its primary use of dice rolls. While this is extremely frustrating to new players, it does mean that you are disincentivized from committing acts of violence, and instead have to learn alternate means of play, be that spells and using magic, avoiding combat at all times, and just hovering everywhere, and so on. The game also lacks any sort of waypoints or little icons to tell you where to go, meaning oftentimes you have to simply piece together what you're supposed to do from contextual clues you gain from the environment, such as talking to NPCs or notes that your player character makes in their journal. This makes the world of the game feel hostile in this really interesting way, and always feels like you have to earn your discoveries through intuition and exploration. While more modern entries are certainly a lot more accessible, that also came of the cost of sanding down a lot of Morrowind's more interesting aspects. The settings became blander, the combat much easier, and there's always guidance on where you need to go and how you're supposed to do it. Something incredibly meaningful was lost in translation for the pursuit of bigger budgets and more profits, and it left a void for a lot of people that has been waiting to be filled. So when people compare Dread Delusion to Morrowind, this is primarily what they're referring to, and in many respects I do actually believe that Dread Delusion fits the bill of Morrowind's true successor, although it does stumble in some key areas that we'll get into. To start illustrating this, I view the game as having 4 tenets of major gameplay which are quite interlocked that I'll list right now, and then begin to untie them as I go along. I'm framing it in this way due to the fact that all of these systems were designed to be experienced in context, not dissimilar to an immersive sim, and so everything must be broken down to understand their relations and what works or doesn't. These 4 tenets are combat, quests, and by extension dialogue, exploration, and resources. Starting off on the right foot, the game's focus on exploration serves it well. The vibes in this game are unreal. Like, it can honestly record any section of this game and it'd be a perfect desktop background. It is so beautiful to look at. When the betas were coming out, I was a little worried that the art design was going to lean more conventional, which I'll get into when I discuss the game's prototypes at the end of the video, but ultimately there's a wide variety of unique things to see here. The world design and signposting is extremely solid. It makes it clear that the game was designed from the ground up to not be using quest markers. Similar to Elden Ring, it's possible to see something really high up, far off in the distance, but not be able to actually access it until much later, and appropriately, when you're in dense packed areas such as forests, it becomes much more difficult to find where you're going without using a compass or something. I can't overstate how important the sense of exploration is to the game's feeling. There is a wonderful sense of discovery that has been recaptured after being discarded for a few decades of modern game design. I would compare this to the feeling folks got when they first played Breath of the Wild and just taking in the atmosphere there, after feeling a bit on rails of Skyward Sword. For the most part, after the introductory island, which even then has quite a lot of optional things to do, the game is fairly non-linear in how you can approach its 3 remaining islands, with a plethora of smaller islets around as well. There's a few locations I simply didn't know existed until I got the airship towards the end of the game. The game is incredibly dense and packed full of stuff to do, which is really cool. Throughout the world, there's also resources that can be gathered, be that plants in order to concoct potions, various upgrade materials for your clothing and weapons, and delusion points. The upgrade materials aren't too much to write home about, although the potions you can brew are pretty useful, and I did like having a choice on where I wanted to ultimately take a weapon with 3 available options for each, but the delusion system requires a bit more elaboration. Similar to heart containers in a Zelda game, a delusion point requires 4 glimpses in order to get a full delusion, after which you can spend it on the 4 major attributes. Might controls maximum health, attack, and defense. Stamina controls maximum stamina, lockpicking, and agility. Wisdom controls maximum mana, lore, and spellcasting potency. And finally, Persona controls regen rate, charm, and barter. Unlike an Elder Scrolls game, there is no stats to be gained from doing combat or specific actions, which I actually like quite a lot since it gives you more incentive to do quest lines and explore in order to get the stats that you need, not dissimilar to the way that Lightning Returns handled it. All 4 of these main stats additionally control specific locks and progression. For instance, certain switches and secrets can only be activated if your lore skill is high enough. A high enough might can smash down certain doors. Being able to charm people can avoid difficult encounters or give you better rewards from quests. And being better at lockpicking means you're less likely to run out of lockpicks when you pick a door. In terms of meta progression, I think this is a good way of handling it, as it makes it so all the main stats are extremely important towards various objectives. And certain equipment can boost your stats further if you're lacking in a certain attribute. The system encourages diverse character progression and incentivizes you to engage with the world and look around and find various things. Where I see a stumble, though, is how this relates with combat. See, there's various options in combat that theoretically are also pretty interesting and good. There's various throwable items that you can collect, a lot of weaponry, along with offensive, defensive, and just generally useful spells like the speed boost. In theory, this would present the ability to think on the fly and have various outs to particular situations, such as using poison shurikens or something against a tough enemy instead of sneaking by it. Kind of like how Thief the Dark Project handles things with smoke bombs when you get caught. In practice, however, the game is way too easy for this to actually be applicable. The tutorial encourages you to sneak before you do combat, and while this is generally a good idea, enemies are just not very threatening even if you don't sneak. It's extremely easy to run around them, and in fact the majority of them either have slow-moving projectiles, or no projectiles at all, along with a fairly generous de-aggro range. They're slightly more of an issue in close quarters, but you can also just jump over them. Considering the fact that you don't get anything from combat besides what an enemy can drop, there's no particular reason to engage in combat unless you're absolutely forced to, which only happens a single time in the whole game. This is further compounded by resource density. As I said, you can gather a lot of them from exploration, which is fine and interesting enough, but the problem with that is that you are constantly swarmed with resources from even basic exploration. Due to how cheap inns are, I barely used health potions and just sold them to merchants, and even then, I didn't need to simply because I could sell all those throwable items I wasn't using for a huge amount of cash, due to how many were just lying around. Of course, to what extent you actually have an issue with this depends on what you're looking for in a game. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with a game being too easy, since that just means pretty much everyone could play it more or less fine and not have any major problems. However, where it starts to become an issue is when you're dealing with systems this complex that are just simply not being utilized. Throughout my entire first playthrough, I never once upgraded my might, and instead just upgraded my equipment in every other stat, and at no point did I actually struggle in the combat simply because of how easy it was. While I was certainly missing out to some extent with certain doors that I could only break down with might, that didn't seem like a worthy enough incentive to actually invest points in the stat, when I could just as easily invest it in points that mattered more to the moment-to-moment gameplay. It can be really hard to balance an open-world game like this, but I feel like the current implementation is too much of an overcorrection, and makes it so a lot of folks simply are not engaging with some of the nuances within the systems, which is a shame since there's a lot of combat stuff that seems pretty cool if there was something worth killing. Since you're constantly swarmed with dough, the barter skills are also fairly useless. While it's nice to have a small discount from raising the stat or having certain equipment, there's no real incentive to prioritize that when in terms of how the economy of the game is actually structured, there's no real need to. Whenever I came across a large purchase I needed to make, I just sold all the useless junk I accumulated instead of actually thinking about what I wanted or not. I wasn't making any complex, interesting decisions through the system, I was just kinda going on autopilot. I imagine in the future there'll be some sort of hard mode modifier that'll increase combat difficulty, but I would also go further and make it so if there is higher difficulties, that the majority of the free pickups in the world would also disappear, making it so you actually have to scrounge and think about what items you sell and what items you keep and so on. Another quibble I have is with the actual stat checks that the game uses. Except for lockpicking, which uses a dice roll that gets easier based on stats, every other skill barrier is a hardline threshold that has to be passed in order to succeed or fail. This is mostly fine when you're interacting with a charm switch or a door you can't break down, since it tells you directly what you need after and you can try again, but where this becomes rather annoying is with lore checks and speech checks and dialogue. For lore checks, the game simply doesn't tell you what threshold you need to pass. What's more annoying is how it often breaks suspension of disbelief. I can understand the checks for complex machinery, since that would logically be based on how much you know about the world, but it's fairly nonsensical for this to apply to secret candle switches and skulls you can push, particularly if you have gears that highlight lore objects for you directly. The lore stat's only purpose in the game is for these checks, and doesn't unlock any additional dialogue options or ability to learn new information, the way it might work in Fallout New Vegas or Disco Elysium. The charm threshold being hidden in dialogue is usually fine, since in most cases you can just retry, but there is one particularly annoying case very late in the game, which I won't spoil, where you only have one opportunity to pass a check, which can permanently affect what ending you receive unless you have the foresight to quit out the game before it has the chance to save. This wouldn't be so bad if you could manually save in the menu or something, but the game autosaves after any item you pick up or any major story event, meaning that choice is taken from your hands in the only instance where it would affect you in a pretty significant way. Fixing these would be a little more extensive than modifying combat difficulty and access to resources, but I think making lore checks also a dice roll would make it much less annoying to deal with at lower levels, and having the raw stat requirement for a charm and dialogue would help mitigate any potential issues. None of what I listed are major problems, it's just the type of thing you notice over hours of play that builds up. Speaking of, quest design can also be a bit of a mixed bag. Individual options and resolutions within them are quite good, which I'll elaborate on in the next section. A few quests require traversing back and forth through a single island once or twice, with generally only the main quests and cartography encompassing the whole group of islands, which works just fine, especially accounting for how the game naturally nudges you towards towns for inns to stave off fatigue, and that's where most quest givers are located. Backtracking is also usually easy as well thanks to unlockable warp points and the home spell, so with some planning, most treks really aren't that big a deal at all. Where this becomes more of an issue though is quests which require multiple treks back and forth fairly arbitrarily, which, while being in the vast minority of quests, becomes a major problem for the main island quests in the Endless Realm and Clockwork Kingdom. A lot of this busy work can thankfully be mitigated further with the use of the airship, which is probably one of the best implemented modes of travel I've seen in like any game. The airship controls like a dream, and there's zero restrictions on where you can travel to or land. If you don't want to pay for a bridge ticket, just fly around the bridge. Wonderful. This thing is super cool and I love it. However, a problem crops up in that you can only get an airship towards the tail end of the main quest, with no indication that this would be the case. Unfortunate for me, I did every major side quest before I actually unlocked the airship, since I was under the assumption that going to the Underlands would be a point of no return, so the airship, while extremely cool, ended up being fairly useless to me. While this is certainly something I now know for replays, I question how clear this is going to be for folks playing for the first time in the future. I understand the narrative justification as to why you can't get an airship earlier in the game, but honestly, I think being able to purchase a lower grade one that wouldn't be able to fly above a certain height and move slower or something would go a long way towards opening up the game's design a little bit more. Overall, nothing in the gameplay is fundamentally broken, but I do feel it needs just a little bit of tuning to flow better. That said, let's now get into the game's story a bit. This thing is a cornucopia of different influences and ideas that all coalesce into some really interesting questlines. Essentially, the driving thrust of the plot is that you are a prisoner of determinate backstory, who's tasked with capturing Velikalos, an infamous sky pirate, in order to earn back your freedom. This is accomplished by approaching all four of her prior companions in order to assemble an A-team that is able to go down into the lower Cursed Lands to find her. Along the way, you can also get involved with various affairs in each of the 3 major islands, dealing with god worship and Wiccan genocide in Hollowshire, the Curse of Eternal Life in the Endless Realm, and an eldritch mechanical automaton in the Clockwork Kingdom. Not to mention more specific interpersonal matters with various folks who have to deal with this nonsense. A lot of the game's setup in the abstract reminds me of the way that Fallout New Vegas handles a lot of its personal and political matters. In Vegas, your primary task is hunting down Benny, and you get tangled up in a web of multiple factions who are all vying for power, and the same applies here. However, Dread Delusion's story influences aren't just rooted in the past, they're a fusion of prior cultural influence and current perspectives on social circumstances and agency. Take the main questline of the Clockwork Kingdom, for instance. You know, the one I just complained about all the running around in. That questline is fairly explicitly about needing to decide between a complete collapse of the current power system, which would free the people but cause a great loss of life, or attempting to reform it from the inside, which would optimize out some of the kinks without dealing with its more root issues. You can certainly choose not to make a decision here, but as the Ghost Girl notes, that in turn is still a decision, as letting things continue the way they are currently won't fix anything and repeat the suffering you are currently seeing regardless. That's just one example, but I think overall, the writing for quests and general dialogue does a good job taking advantage of the setting's context in order to say some interesting things about real life, these vignettes of suffering building into moral questions you need to ponder. Before discussing the overall ending, spoilers ahead by the way, I did want to give some more elaboration on the Ghost Girl's character. She has a name by the way, it's just a spoiler you can uncover yourself. The Ghost Girl has existed in some form or another since the game's original alpha, and how she is used is a linchpin to the story's themes in a way similar to the likes of Kreia or Kim. She's continually asking you your thoughts on matters and why you believe the things you do, with any answer you give having a fairly reasonable counterpoint to consider. This is why she's present at the beginning of every single major island. She is intended to complicate what would normally be a moral binary by giving you nuance and complexity. The final choice that you make is quite interesting thanks to the context provided by the rest of the game. You are presented with the power to completely rewrite reality in order to make it so that there is no suffering or systemic injustice, so should you do so? Is it right for you as a singular person to be making this decision on the behalf of everyone, including a lot of folks who have no idea what was even going on to begin with? While there can certainly be an argument that the end justifies the means, I think the state of the Endless Realm is an example of how this may be flawed thinking. Being able to exist without death would mean an endless existence of listlessness, an eternal paradise of existence where everyone becomes everything over time. It reminds me of themes that Lightning Returns explores with a similar concept, how grief can motivate wanting to change the world potentially at the expense of others. If you agree that the way Vela is approaching this is incorrect, then of course you wouldn't choose to rewrite reality, and that in fact it would be quite hypocritical to do so. The game doesn't give you an easy answer to this. It's ultimately up to you to decide what you think is right, with the ending regardless of the final choice taking into account individual major decisions you made in the islands in a pretty satisfactory way. The story is overall solid, and I'm quite happy with it, and I think that the game on the whole is just fine, barring a few bugs I encountered that I believe have already been patched. For the last section, I want to dive into the game's alphas and betas, since I know too much about them, and when else am I going to discuss these? The first alpha was released on the original Haunted PS1 demo disc, and honestly, despite some jank, I still value it very highly, to the point I would want this version of the game to be finished more or less as originally intended, which is not to disparage the full release since it's great too, but there's a few things that were lost in translation. The alpha is very dense and meaningful due to the fact that it was originally a project made by one person. Now, as my friend Sammy would say, it's full of magical wonder, which is hard to expand and quantify into a full-fledged game the way that the final does. Around every corner, you can see the concessions necessary in order to actually have this game be completable instead of forever sitting in a limbo, such as having a text interface for various locations rather than presenting them graphically. Part of my initial animosity towards the betas once the game acquired a publisher was due to the fact that a lot of the weird stuff that was in the alphas simply wasn't in the game yet. Initially, to me, it felt like a lot of sanding down of the more interesting elements in order to be more mainstream and Elder Scrolls-y, which certainly wasn't helped by how some music tracks were incorporated into the game. Which, no shade to the composer, was completely at odds with the game's intended vibe. After subsequent updates and the final release rolled around though, I was very happy to see a lot of the alpha elements resurfacing, most obvious with the Ghost Girl, but also the original layout of the Clockwork Kingdom being a late game dungeon. although sadly not the excellent field that's outside of it since the context was changed. It almost feels liminal looking at these environments this way, these familiar twists and turns having a home, memories of things that are now gone. Again, to reiterate, I am not disparaging the full release, just that this alpha has elements I still really vibe with and connect with years later that, while present in the final to some extent, doesn't have the same vibe to it, which makes it hard to quantify as substantive criticism on my part. I'm sure there's folks out there who may argue that they vibe more with how the final handles everything, and that is completely fine, since these types of aesthetic arguments are very personal, and I can always just play the alpha if that's what I really want to do. In closing, Dread Delusion is a solid game with some mild flaws that ultimately don't significantly detract from the experience for me. I recommend this game to anyone who wants a retrox look at what could have been in terms of game design and aesthetics, and also to people who just like these types of RPGs in general. This game is a huge culmination for the developer based on what he was interested in for years, and I think it succeeded in what it wanted to do. Thank you very much to my patrons for supporting my work, and I'll see y'all later.